You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. The Russian president, likely Mr. Trump's guest at the White House as early as fall. Could the second meeting be the charm? We'll ask our panelists right after this break. Come back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The White House confirms Russian President Vladimir Putin could come to Washington as early as this fall for more talks over improving ties. The announcement was made amid the fallout from Mr. Trump's summit with Mr. Putin in Helsinki. The summit has left the U.S. president deeply unpopular again in Washington for the time being.
The Russian and U.S. presidents sat down in Helsinki last week with the goal of improving bilateral ties. But the media briefing after the meeting prompted fury in Washington. Mr. Trump described his meeting with Putin as a success, despite a barrage of criticism, and Putin says critics of their summit are out to derail efforts to improve relations.
We see that there are forces in the United States that are prepared to casually sacrifice Russia and U.S. relations, to sacrifice them for their ambitions in the course of an internal political battle.
In Helsinki, Mr. Trump was asked about U.S. intelligence reports that squarely blame Moscow for meddling in the 2016 presidential election. Russia has denied any such involvement, and Trump seemed to have accepted Putin's version over that of the U.S. intelligence services. Back on U.S. soil, Trump said he misspoke. What he intended to say was he accepted U.S. intelligence conclusions. He then welcomed a group of Republican lawmakers to the White House for talks. Members of his party had condemned Trump's behavior as shameful and a disgrace.
Vladimir Putin does not share our interests. Vladimir Putin does not share our values. We just conducted a year-long investigation into Russia's interference in our elections. They did interfere in our elections. It's really clear. There should be no doubt about that.
To create an equivalence between our intelligence agencies and what Putin is saying, and then for the president to say, well, why would they do it? Russia, well, I mean, it's just such a naive comment.
The U.S. and Russia have been long-term adversaries and stand apart on major issues. What would it take to break the ice between Russia and the U.S.?
Of course, those are the arguments coming from the U.S. side, but of course, there are also arguments coming from the Russian side. We're going to hear that in our discussion. For more discussion on the fallout of the Putin-Trump summit, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Mr. Cui Hongzhen, who is the head of the European Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. Joining us in Moscow, Mark Sloboda, International Relations and Security Analyst, who's here to bring us the Russian perspective. In Pittsburgh, in the U.S., we invited Joe Rubin, president of the Washington Strategy Group. Welcome to all of you, gentlemen. Let me begin by asking you, Mr. Rubin, is that quite a heavy pressure on President Trump now when it comes to U.S.-Russia relations?
Well, good morning, Jen. And there's
Hello.
significant pressure on the president, largely due to his own making. And he really created a firestorm in Helsinki that is going to be difficult for him to walk back from. But we have to remember that the context in that summit was also very negative. He came into the summit attacking American allies in NATO and in the United Kingdom, and earlier at the G7 summit, he attacked Canada, he's attacked France, and then at his press conference with Vladimir Putin, he looked almost obsequious. He looked as if he wanted to see what Vladimir Putin would say first, and then he would agree with it. And Americans aren't used to that. So when he came back here to Washington, he tried to re-explain his bad words, his bad use of language in the previous day's press conference. It didn't convince anyone, and so I think there are still many open questions, and more open questions now than there were prior to the summit.
I see. From the Russian perspective, Mr. Sloboda, I understand the Russian President Vladimir Putin has been recently talking about the so-called, quote, powerful forces in the United States, quote, try to drag the two countries apart. Do you agree with him? What do you make of the latest Helsinki summit between U.S. and Russia?
Well, let me first say that I think Trump's performance during this summit was unhinged, incoherent, devolving into insecure defenses of his election and ranting about the Electoral College, none of which was appropriate for the venue, which is a summit between the U.S. and the Russian or Soviet presidents, is something that every president has done since Franklin Delano Roosevelt at least once, and it's extremely needed today. But I do agree that there are powerful partisan and deep state political forces that are adamantly opposed to any détente between the U.S. and Russia. As much as they may hate to admit this, Donald Trump was elected on an explicit foreign policy campaign of shaking up U.S. foreign policy and of détente with Russia. He made this clear, and he was elected on the issue. But there's a lot of people, unelected bureaucrats, senior intelligence, military officials, both in and out of office, who still hold a great deal of power, who are really opposed to this. They do not believe that the U.S. president is allowed to change foreign policy on these issues.
I see. But you see, there are different debates going on inside the United States about exactly what should be the nature of relations. So are people just upset about Trump's behavior at the summit, or people are upset about a change of U.S.-Russia relationship from the earlier really frozen one to a relatively warmer one? Let's take a look at a quote coming from Dr. Henry Kissinger, certainly one of the most important figures in international relations for contemporary time. In an interview with Financial Times not long ago, Henry Kissinger commented on the Putin-Trump meeting. He said this, quote, "It was a meeting that had to take place. I have advocated it for several years. It has been submerged by American domestic issues. It is certainly a missed opportunity." And of quote, that is coming from Dr. Kissinger. Now, Mr. Rubin, he is Republican, but he's relatively neutral when it comes to international relations. So what do you make of this comment made by Dr. Kissinger and the overall nature of U.S.-Russia rapprochement toward one another at this juncture?
Well, Dr. Kissinger is right, and I think that that's a false argument that's being made, that somehow a quote-unquote deep state doesn't support American-Russian engagement. When I served in the Obama administration, we engaged Russia significantly and constantly on nuclear weapons issues, and Russia turned its back on President Obama when he sought to have further reductions in nuclear weapons. Nonetheless, the United States did work with Russia on the Iran nuclear deal. So this idea that somehow the deep state opposes engagement is just false on its face. The problem we have right now is that American patriots, our intelligence community, identify that Russia invaded our democracy in 2016, and the president has not come clean on that or has not allowed that investigation to proceed without trying to throw up roadblocks in every direction. And the result now is we see, for example, a one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin where the president did not have any note-takers in the room. He hasn't given guidance to his Defense Department or his intelligence community. So we have a foreign policy that seems to be being guided by Russia. And that's what gives people concern. Our interests are different from Russia's, but we don't quite know where that difference is right now from this administration.
But Mr. Rubin, there's one word I did hear very clearly, that you worked for the Obama administration and you approached Russia. You said at that time Russia turned its back against President Obama and his time. Is that what you're trying to say? This is very important because President Trump certainly has been accusing his predecessor of doing everything wrong, and nobody has accused Obama of doing wrong.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you asked that again. It's a false argument. President Obama negotiated a treaty called New START to reduce nuclear weapons with, at the time, President Medvedev, that we pushed forward through the Congress with bipartisan support in the Senate. He then went further and sought to have further nuclear reductions with Russia, and in 2013, it's very clear, there's a historic record there, President Putin and his team said no, they were not going to further engage on nuclear weapons reductions. And then in 2014, the Ukraine invasion happened, and things have gone in a negative direction since then. But it's a false argument to say that somehow President Obama did not engage Russia. That is truly the opposite of what took place.
Mr. Sloboda, looking at his facial impression, it seems that he has a very different view there. Mr. Sloboda, your time to come in.
Yeah, I can't agree with much of what was said there. First of all, it is blatantly false that there were no note takers in the room. There were translators on both sides whose jobs it is to write up and prepare a transcript of what was said. And no doubt by now, both leaders of
notes.
That's
not accurate.
Both the leaders, the top officials of both the Russia and the U.S. government will have seen the transcripts of this session by now. Whether they choose to share them with the public is besides.
No, note takers take
the breakdown
notes.
in U.S.-Russia relations. The breakdown of U.S.-Russia relations. If you could please wait a minute, Mr. Rubin, I'm sure that it'll give you time to repeat your fake news. The U.S.-Russia relations broke down during the Obama administration, most spectacularly with the U.S. attacks on and regime change, which overthrew the government of Libya. And that's when the Russian president saw that there really is no difference between Republican and Democratic officials. They're both committed to global military hegemony, exerting military force around the world in complete and brazen defiance of international law. They saw this again in Syria. They saw this with the putsch that the U.S. instigated and fomented in Ukraine, which overthrew the democratically elected government, and so on. So it certainly isn't true that Obama negotiated with Russia in any type of good faith. This continues through the present administration, which has actually been much worse with Russia, rhetoric aside.
Here's the thing, Mr. Sloboda. Do you think Russia is happier when there's a president called Donald Trump sitting in the White House? Do you think Russia think about a bigger potential of warming relations when Trump is the president? You see it, what is going on now, the Congress is trying to levy further sanctions against Russia, even after that Helsinki summit, even after an apparently much warmer White House. Mr. Sloboda, very briefly from you about that.
Yeah, President Putin was quite clear about this. After the summit, after the election, he was quite clear that he did prefer to see President Trump elected. And this is also true of the last election. He preferred to see President Obama elected over Mitt Romney. This is simply because at the time, both leaders said that they wanted to improve. And this is quite obvious. The president of Russia would prefer to have better relations, whether that was Obama's rhetoric at the time or the rhetoric that Trump is unable to fulfill over his own deep state and regime right now.
All right. And Mr. Cui, you've been attentively and patiently listening to your two colleagues coming from both Russia and the United States. Let me ask you about that. Russia now is one of the most powerful nuclear nations in the world, nuclear weapon, that's what I'm talking about, and probably in some areas even exceeding the United States. The other thing is you see Russia is getting ever more influential in some of the most important hotspot issues around the world, be it Middle East or elsewhere. So what about the recent interactions between Washington and Moscow? What does the current circumstances tell you about where that relation is likely to go, given the heavy stakes here, Mr. Cui?
Yes, also, even now with a recent so-called historic meeting in Helsinki between two presidents, and of course, I think that we are not yet has a very clear, scenario for the Russia and the U.S. relations, because even we heard a lot of, good things and good words from Mr. Trump towards Mr. Putin, but still we can find a very, very realistic, situation for this relations between two countries. For example, just like you mentioned, that how about this a kind of a confrontation on the nuclear weapon? So now, yes, it's time for Russia to have another, diplomatic attack against the United States. Say that okay, now it's good time for us to continue this so-called strategic arms reduction treaty, the third one. So of course now the ball is in the court of the United States.
Right.
So which kind of a response from Mr. Trump to this proposal? Another issue, just like you mentioned, is how about this regional hotspot? a lot of conflicts between Russia and the United States. For example, how about the scenario for Middle East and Iran, Syria, after withdrawal of United States from Iranian nuclear accord? And then how about Ukraine? How about Crimea? So yes, there are a lot of good things happened between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin. But at the same time,
we don't know because it's off the record and it's only to go with two interpreters.
Still, I mean, very, very bad situation, a kind of maybe really confrontation situation between two countries.
All right. After analysis coming from a third party, I have to go back to the two colleagues in Russia and the U.S. Very briefly, 30 seconds for both of you. Where are we going? What are the things that we should really concentrate our attention on? Is it going to be a nuclear weapon issue? Is it going to be a hotspot issue? Is it going to be the election and the investigation about Mr. Trump in 2016? And it is going to be the sanctions against Russia coming from the U.S. What about Russia toward the United States too? What about regional issues, DPRK, Korean Peninsula, many others? So let me have 30 seconds from each one of you. Let's Sloboda, Mr. Sloboda, you go first. 30 seconds, sir.
Yeah, I don't think that there's going to be much movement on a lot of those issues. I think there can be some movement in Syria where President Trump clearly wants to withdraw the U.S.'s forces which are deployed illegally, military occupying East Syria. There's some cooperation with Israel there and some limits to where Iran has its forces in Syria. I think we are seeing some closed-door sessions on a New START and the INF treaty, but a lot of people in Russia don't want to see these sanctions gone, and Jackson Vanik tells us anything is that we can't expect improvement on those type of relations perhaps for decades.
All right. Mr. Rubin, final words, also 30 seconds for you, sir.
Well, I think first and foremost, the elections coming up in 2018 this fall, that's what matters to the American people and Congress as well. And now apparently the intelligence community and our Homeland Security Department as well. So we need to make sure that Russia doesn't meddle in these elections and the American people have a real voice in the next formation of their government. And separately, the President needs to come clean with his Defense Department and intelligence community on what he agreed to so they have direction on how to engage and deal with Russia going forward.
None of those things are easy at all. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Cui Hongjian, Mark Sloboda, Joe Rubin, thank you. Really appreciate it.